America and other free and open societies face crucial challenges and opportunities abroad that affect security and prosperity at home. This is a series of conversations with guests who bring deep understanding of today's battlegrounds and creative ideas about how to compete, overcome challenges, capitalize on opportunities, and secure a better future. I am H.R. McMaster. This is Battlegrounds.
On today's episode of Battlegrounds, our focus is on the Kingdom of Norway, a strong economic and security partner of the United States. Our guest is Her Excellency Ine Eriksen Søreide, member of the Norwegian Parliament and chair of the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and Defense. Ms. Søreide served as Minister of Foreign Affairs from 2017 to 2021 and was the first woman to hold that position. She previously served as Minister of Defense, where she called for increased NATO defense spending following the 2014 Russian invasion of Crimea. She has been a member of Parliament since 2001. Ms. Søreide began her career as a television producer and is a graduate of the University of Tromsø, where she studied law. Norway is strategically located in northwestern Europe and was the only NATO member to share a border with the Soviet Union. The Kingdom of Norway was established in 872 CE and has existed continuously since, including as parts of unions with both the Kingdom of Denmark and the Kingdom of Sweden. In 1814, Norway adopted its current constitution and peacefully transferred power from its absolute monarchy to democratic institutions based on the principles of sovereignty of the people, separation of powers, and human rights. Upon separation from Sweden in 1905, Norway declared its neutrality, which persisted through World War I, though both commercial and political sympathies tied Norway to Britain throughout the war. Despite declaring neutrality at the outbreak of World War II, Nazi Germany invaded Norway in April 1940. Norwegian and Allied resistance efforts on land had limited effectiveness, but the resistance inflicted lasting damage on the German naval fleet. After the war, Norway became a founding member of NATO and the United Nations. The United States and Norway have enjoyed a peaceful and productive relationship. Norway received Marshall Plan funds to modernize its economy. The post-war socialist government distanced itself from the communist bloc and strengthened foreign policy and defense ties with the United States. Norway has twice been asked to join the European Union and twice declined, following narrow defeats in referendums in 1972 and 1994. Carefully balancing diplomatic relations during the Cold War, Norway frequently hosted NATO exercises and allowed Soviet-owned mining operations on its territory. The discovery of oil and gas in the North Sea in the 1960s and its subsequent extraction has fueled persistent economic growth and allowed Norway to create the world's largest sovereign wealth fund. Norway's government structure and safety have made it a destination for immigrants and asylum seekers from around the world. Norwegian troops have served with distinction in the Balkans, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. The Norwegian Air Force participated in the 2011 military intervention in Libya. Norway is central to multinational discussions concerning the protection of the Arctic with its control of the Svalbard, the world's most northern permanent settlement. We welcome Ine Søreide to discuss significant geopolitical shifts after Russia's renewed invasion of Ukraine and the implications for European security, the European Union, NATO, and the transatlantic relationship.
Ine Eriksen Søreide, welcome. It is so good to see you again and a pleasure to have you on Battlegrounds.
Thank you so much, HR. It's really good to see you again, too. It's been some years now.
It has been a few years. And you know, with the, I think we might just start because we're talking so recently after the terrible assassination of Prime Minister Abe, somebody who I had the pleasure of knowing and hosting on this series. And I wonder if you might share a few thoughts about Prime Minister Abe and his legacy.
Well, it was a terrible shock to hear about his assassination, and of course, for anyone who has followed international politics for some years, they've also seen the efforts he made, not only as the longest-serving Japanese prime minister, but also the fact that he wanted to reform, especially on the security policy side, a very, I would say, conservative Japanese society, and a society that was really still marked after the war. And his way of trying to make changes in the constitution, trying to change the self-defense forces, knowing full well what the threat assessment and the picture around Japan was and how it changed over time. So I really think he was a one who wanted to reform. Of course, not always easy, but I think his legacy will be one of reform and also courage to try to shake up some of the ideas, some of the legacy that wasn't really all that fit for purpose anymore when the world changed. And of course, societies are, to a certain extent, always conservative in the sense that change is not easy, and change shouldn't always be easy. For instance, when it comes to constitutional amendments, they shouldn't be done overnight. There's a reason for them being in the constitution. But having said that, when the world changes, everyone has to relate to the world as it is and not as it was or as we'd like it to be. And that is why I think those who are doing moderate but well thought through reforms should also have that as part of their legacy.
He was a visionary. I remember, I think he first mentioned the phrase Indo-Pacific in 2006. And our friend here at the Hoover Institution, a fellow here, Matt Pottinger, said that Abe invented the Indo-Pacific, and he really did. There's so much to talk about, right? And I remember when we first met, and you graciously hosted me at this small island lighthouse on an island off of Oslo for a fantastic dinner, and we were talking about Russia. Russia had recently invaded Ukraine, and the presentation that I gave at the Army conference was on Russian new generation warfare. The U.S. Army had just completed a study on Russian new generation warfare, and we often talk about black swans, right? Unanticipated events, but this was a pink flamingo. I think the reinvasion of Ukraine. What is your reaction to the invasion from Norway's perspective, and how do you think this fits into Putin's broader campaign to advance his objectives?
Well, I think it's no doubt that this fits well in. I mean, if you look at Putin and his political career and his legacy, there are some features that I think are important to remember right now. One of them being that he, of course, always takes a very revisionist view on things. He looks back at history, he's not looking into the future. And he never really accepted the dissolution of the Soviet Union, which means that in his mind and the regime's mind, he still has a legitimate right to exert influence over neighboring states that used to be a part of the Soviet Union. Of course, no one else accepts that history point of view, but in his mind, that is part of what should build his legacy. He has never respected human rights. He has never respected the sovereignty of states or the ideas of democracy, rule of law. And that comes very clear to the forefront right now because he doesn't shy away from anything in his pursuit for that, I would say, that very important influence to the Russian regime. And I also think it's important to remember in these days that one of the things that he's most afraid of is democracy and the fact that countries around Russia are having democracies developing, they're having economic growth, people are allowed to express themselves freely, to start enterprises, to go abroad to study, and so forth. That is maybe one of the biggest threats to his regime and his ruling, that democracy has a very, I would say, a clear tendency to be contagious to the countries around it. And when he sees the risk of democracy, he's also seeing the risk of being undermined as a ruler. And that is maybe one of the most dangerous features. And of course, this all started when Ukraine very clearly turned westwards. Remember back in 2014, and we had this conversation, you and I, after 2014 on what actually was the trigger points to the annexation of Crimea. And I think one of the most important things was that Ukraine at that time was about to sign an association agreement with the EU. And that would, of course, cement, I would say, the West turning, West leaning of Ukraine in a way that he could not accept. And of course, that was condemned broadly and widely. But if we just take a pause for a minute, you would also see that the annexation of Crimea also followed in the path of what he did in Georgia in 2008. It was an attack on Georgia that was, I would say, by and large, not really dealt with by the Western world, in the sense that business went on as usual. There were some voices as to how damaging this was, but nothing really happened. No consequences came of it.
Right.
I think that paved the way for the annexation of Crimea, because Putin had seen that, well, in his mind, this was a way to exert influence that would not have any repercussions for Russia, at least not notable repercussions. And after the annexation of Crimea, of course, the international condemnation was much stronger. And sanctions and restrictive measures came in place. Norway, as a non-EU member, we aligned fully, and we have aligned fully ever since 2014 with the EU sanctions on Russia. But there has also been, of course, from every European country, still interaction with Russia, even though the condemnation was strong. And I think what he concluded was that, yes, it would have a political cost to do more in Ukraine than continue the war that he has been going on with now for the past 8 years in the east of Ukraine. But it wouldn't have a political cost that was impossible for them to carry. Well, he was not, I think, taking into account the very, very strong Western alliance, the unity, the strong condemnation, at least from the countries that was important to him in his immediate neighborhood. Of course, there are countries, and I would say populous countries, who have either kind of not taken a decision as to what to condemn and what not to condemn. And there are countries who are aligning with Russia in this. But I think that the very unanimous and very clear signals from Western countries was not what he expected. In, of course, addition to not expecting this to be a long haul fight. I mean, what he had given to both the Chinese and others were that this was supposed to be a fight that could go on maybe for a week or so, and then Kiev would be taken and a new regime would be instated, a regime that would take care of Russian and not Ukrainian interests. So I think this falls very typically into the picture of who he is, what his ideas are. And I'm sorry to say that this was not surprising. I've been saying in a couple of instances that I think this war was, the brutality is surprising, but the war and the invasion itself was surprisingly unsurprising in my opinion.
Right. And, especially after last August, publishing this 7,000 word essay, as you're making so many important points here, I think is for us to learn from what's happened so far and apply it to the future. We didn't do enough, obviously, we being, the Western world and like-minded nations, including NATO and certain non-NATO countries, to deter Putin, and it was a failure of deterrence. So I think you're right. A Ukrainian friend of mine who's been on Battlegrounds, actually, he called it the vegetarian response to the 2014 invasion. And of course, we have that unfortunate image of then Secretary Clinton bringing the reset button to Lavrov right after really the invasion of Georgia in 2008. But it wasn't just the Obama administration. It was multiple U.S. administrations thought, okay, if we just accommodate with Putin, if we just allay his concerns, then he'll maybe change his ways. And of course, that debate is still going on. There's still some people recommending President Macron has been in this camp, and Chancellor Scholz, although he's moved off it a bit, saying, well, can we find an off-ramp for Putin? But, I think an off-ramp for Putin is just an opportunity for him to look for another on-ramp. So what are your thoughts about these proposals for negotiations at this stage? What do you think the chances are of Putin having a fundamental change of heart?
I don't think they are present at the moment. And I think the war has now gone on for such a long time that it is also very difficult to see any kind of negotiations that are meaningful coming up anytime soon. And of course, that has to do with the strength on the ground. And you would know more about this than many, that negotiating from a position of strength is very different compared to negotiating from a position of weakness. And I very much fear that there will be no meaningful or real negotiations until there is one party that feels or thinks that it has the upper hand on the ground. And right now, the devastation, the enormous the consequences, the tragedy for the people of Ukraine is just so enormous that I think it's very difficult for us to grasp the enormity of it all. And we're looking at war crimes. We're looking at a country that needs to be rebuilt from the bottom in many places. And the trauma that the people have been subject to over these months since the 24th.
More than half of the children are displaced.
Yes, more than half of the children are displaced. More than 9 million people have either fled the country or are internally displaced. So it's really, it's just enormous. And people keep forgetting that Ukraine is a big country. They have some 41 million inhabitants. And it's really, it is a country also, of course, that has its struggles also before the war, or rather this war, because the attack on Ukraine started with the annexation of Crimea, and the war has been going on for 8 long years in the East. And I've visited the contact line, and it was a really devastating experience because I don't think at that time people realized, people outside the region realized how enormous the trauma and the devastation was. Some 15,000 people had been killed up until then. There were 1.5 million people who were internally displaced on a geographically very, very small piece of land in the heart of Europe. All the international humanitarian organizations were present, trying to help people with their basic needs like food, shelter, water, medicines. And the conditions that people were living under were just, I would say, it was horrible to see.
And this was all before February 24th, just to remind our viewers, this is all before February 24th.
Before 24th, yes.
The other point that you made that I think is really important is that Putin didn't get the international response he expected, right? He expected division, he got unity. He expected weakness. I think he got more strength than he bargained for in terms of the EU's response, NATO's response, Norway's response, the UK. I think the US, Japan, Singapore joined the sanctions against Russia. And I wondered how you would grade what we've done since the failure to deter. I'll tell you, I was very disappointed with what we did before February 24th. We kept talking about everything we weren't going to do, right? And we weren't providing, I think, the defensive capabilities that may have dissuaded Putin if he had seen the Ukrainian military gaining more defensive capabilities. We pulled out of the Black Sea. I could go on, but after February 24th, slowly but surely, we've been increasing the capabilities of the Ukrainian armed forces. The condemnation has been pretty much universal among like-minded countries, at least. The sanctions have been imposed from the economic and financial sanctions that aim to reduce the resources available to Putin for his war-making machine. How do you grade the response? What more do you think needs to be done?
Well, I think the response has been overall very good and very united. And I think that has in itself been a very important thing in our joint response. Of course, over time, that could be challenged because different countries have kind of different challenges. They have different interests. But what we've seen so far, and I think very much with the US at the helm as well, importantly, because US leadership is needed not only in these situations, but in any situation regarding security policy transatlantically. So I think that it has been a good response, the willingness to step up, the willingness to do things that countries haven't done before. Like, for instance, most European countries have never donated weapons to a country at war. So shifting away from that political line has been quite momentous in European countries, Norway included. But when things started to move, it moved quickly. And I'm just very alert on the fact that we have to keep our attention up. It's very easy when a war has gone on for months. The pictures you see rolling over the screen 24/7 are just devastating. And it's very much to take in for most people. But I'm very afraid that over time, you can see a certain fatigue, both when it comes to the willingness to help, people's attention overall. And I'm just very mindful of the fact that we have work to do jointly to continue to keep the attention high on the agenda. And I think right now, of course, I mean, to be very honest, we're in a perfect storm right now, if you can call it that. We see so many crises being exacerbated by each other. We see the war coming on top of countries not even being out of the pandemic yet. It comes as a way of multiplying already existing crises, but it also brings new crises, like a food crisis, like energy crisis. So we're now going to grapple with all of this. And that is that crucial point where I fear that over time, it can be more important for certain countries to take care of what they would call their national interest, both because they are geographically quite far away from the war, or that they have seen that they can do, they have done more or less what they can do. And that is where the responsibility of just keeping the help up, keeping the attention up is going to be very, very important. And you have to remember also that when you talk about what we have done and what the West have done, like-minded countries have done, I would also say it's quite interesting to see what has happened in NATO over these months. I mean, the debate on NATO in Sweden and Finland just matured in a matter of days and weeks. Right. And those two countries, very dear neighbors to us, they are also they've taken enormous steps and shown, I would say, bravery in facing a new security policy situation. And what they have done, of course, is going to strengthen NATO, no doubt. But it's also very important to see how things or the picture have changed completely over the past months, also with the new strategic concept that was adopted now at the Madrid summit. When I came into this in 2013 as a new defense minister, the strategic concept from 2010 had no mention of China and mentioned Russia as a strategic partner, which is quite interesting to think about now.
Russia was still observing on the NATO Council, was still in Brussels.
Exactly. And this is a really, I mean, it's an anecdote, but I think it's an interesting one to just talk about how quickly these changes happened. My first ministerial in October 2013, I had been a minister for 5 days, and the ministerial came up in Brussels. And the Russian defense minister was a guest at the defense ministerial. He sat up at the podium together with Anders Fogh Rasmussen. There were gift exchanges. It was everyone was in a good mood and so forth. My next ministerial in 2014 took place exactly when Russia annexed Crimea. And that says a lot about how quickly these changes can happen and how immensely important it has been for NATO to just stand shoulder by shoulder now, and also to offer countries who now feel threatened by the new situation and the fact that Russia is again attacking a neighboring country, to take them into the security community that NATO represents.
Ine, could you talk a little bit more about NATO expansion with Finland and Sweden? Of course, you share a border with Russia. Finland shares an immense border with Russia, and of course, a history of 1939 that looks a lot like February 24th or the invasion of 2014. Mm-hmm. So does Poland 1939, by the way, from the perspective of Nazi Germany in terms of events that led up to the reinvasion of Ukraine. But Finland, has been under duress for a long time, as have other countries on the border of Russia. They developed a pretty significant capability to counter Russian subversion. They have a center that's dedicated to that. I think they're going to bring a lot of tremendous expertise to NATO, but I'd love to hear your thoughts. The last time we spoke, you were about to go into the Norwegian parliamentary vote to approve, from Norway's perspective, their acceptance into NATO. But what do Sweden and Finland bring to the alliance?
But they bring a whole lot to the alliance. I mean, they are NATO's closest partners even now. But the fact that we're now going to be under the same security umbrella, the same guarantees, the joint defense planning, not least, so that we can not only do things together in peacetime and during exercises, but we can just apply the same things if a crisis or war occurs. And that is going to be a tremendous change. And I also think that we will see very clearly that this enhances the security, not only regionally in our region, in the Nordic region, but also in Europe, transatlantically. And also, I think it has enormous political value because we are a community of values in NATO. And the fact that they decided to join fully means a whole lot. And it also means that, I mean, look at a country like Finland that you mentioned yourself. They have a very clear, I would say, realistic policy into this discussion. As you say, they have a long border with Russia. They have experienced how this can be before. And what they are seeing is that they have to have a realistic view on this. When Russia again attacks a neighboring country, I think to a certain extent, Finland felt that they didn't have much choice other than to reorient themselves away from where they were, and not only being the closest partner, but taking the step fully and becoming a member. Same thing with Sweden. For Sweden, the freedom of alliances for them is very rooted. It's identity as much as it is security policy. So for them to shift away from that policy also took a lot of courage. And I think that it's going to be strongly felt across the alliance that we're now able to do more things together, not only for peacetime purposes, but in fact also for a challenging situation or a situation where a crisis can actually occur. This was not in Putin's calculus, I think. I think he was planning to use the invasion of Ukraine again to deter Sweden and Finland from entering into NATO. But of course, the reverse thing happened. And that also shows how, of course, strong and powerful NATO is. But it's also a very good picture of how countries are not letting Russia bully them around, like Russia is usually doing with countries who differ in opinion, or with people in their country who differ in opinion, which we have seen so many examples of in the past years. And I think it's important for us to remember, as neighboring country, for us, for Finland, and even though Sweden do not have a border with Russia, of course, they are in the middle of Norway and Finland. I think it's so important for us to remember that the Russia that we are neighboring is not a different Russia from the Russia invading Ukraine. It's the same Russia. It's the same regime. Right. And they have a policy that is unacceptable for us as neighbors. We cannot live in fear of Russia either being aggressive towards us or being aggressive towards other neighboring countries. And that is why they are coming into NATO now, and they are more than welcome. And we ratified in Parliament as early as the 16th of June. So we have done all the paperwork, so to say. So when everything is signed and finished in NATO, so we are then ready to just welcome them.
You mentioned Russian aggression on your borders, submarines encroaching toward your coastlines, and mobilization sometimes along your border. You've seen it over many years. One of the aspects of Russia's initial failure in Ukraine was that their military didn't live up to their appearance, right? They looked very good on parade, on the Victory Day parades, but they didn't look very good on this offensive and in critical areas of reconnaissance, integration of combined arms and joint capabilities, logistics. And did that surprise you? And what do you think the causes were of Russian conventional military weakness and vulnerabilities that were displayed during the reinvasion in February, March of this year?
Well, I'm sure there are others who are even better placed to answer that question in depth, but I could try to offer some explanations. I mean, we've seen ever since 2008, 2009, quite a large modernization of the Russian armed forces. And it was also necessary in a way because they have not done that for the past decades. So they had to do something in order to keep their military ability up. But I'm not entirely sure that they have a military culture that allows for the honest discussion of how the situation is. And you can see that on the battlefield as well. How they are doing leadership on the battlefield is sometimes very illustrative to how they are doing leadership and how they are telling people higher up in the system what the real challenge here is. And interestingly, this is just a sidestep, but still, I think it's also very interesting to see how China is reading this, because China has most of their, I would say, military learnings and experiences by looking at Russia. And what they are seeing is not something that they are very comfortable with. I mean, they see that this is not a military that kept the standards that we thought they did. And it's going to be very interesting what kind of conclusions China draw from this. Because if they see that, well, they have the same, in a way, culture for not letting the higher level know the exact status of the forces, this exact situation, what they can do, what they cannot do, then they would also be, I think, a bit challenged. And they also buy a lot of military equipment from Russia. So this is really, this is just a sidestep, but I think it's interesting to see what kind of conclusions they draw over time. But we witnessed over the past years that Russia, they wanted to display not only their new military equipment, they have commissioned some new equipment that, in my opinion, poses a very, I would say, a big strategic challenge to NATO potentially. And of course, one of them is the Severodvinsk class submarines that are very, very quiet, difficult to detect, that also can effectively, and the Russians can now effectively shut off the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap, and by that also hampering the reinforcements to Europe in a situation of crisis. And this we know. They also exercised, I would say, more complex flight pattern. They also exercised some mock attacks on our installations. But by and large, I would say that we had in the high north, there is a relative, I would say, low tension and calm. And we've been working a lot to keep it that way. But I don't think we can be naive about this, because when interests are diverging, you will also see that a country like Russia will probably have no intentions to take care of other countries' interests than their own. And we've seen that right now as well. So we saw modernized armed forces from Russia. We saw the commissioning of new capabilities. We saw the use and also the placement of long-range precision-guided missiles. We could see all of the things that they've been increasing. But most importantly, in our immediate neighborhood, has been the reinvigoration of the bastion defense concept that is so important for them. And of course, they have much of their nuclear capabilities at the Kola Peninsula, which is literally at our doorstep. And that is also why we wanted to drag NATO's attention up north, just to make sure that everyone knew the strategic challenge that potentially could be there. And I remember my first meeting with Jim Mattis as defense secretary. The most important thing I brought with me to the meeting was a picture of the Severodvinsk class submarine, because that was so important for us to convey to the US that this was really one of the big strategic challenges that we saw. And I had the pleasure of working closely with Jim, but also 2 other defense secretaries and 3 other secretaries of state. So it's been wonderful to get to know all of them, from both Republicans and Democrats, and it's been a wonderful thing to be able to work with them.
So I'd like to talk with you about the response now to the Russian invasion. We talked a little bit about how we didn't do enough after 2014 or 2008 invasion of Georgia, for that matter, or 2007 denial of service attacks on Estonia, or you could go on about it. But so what more do you think we should do in defense? And I'm going to ask you some follow-on questions about what we've talked about a little bit, energy security, where Norway is a huge global player there, and then also supply chain resilience. And that, of course, will bring in China. But first, what more needs to happen in defense? There's some encouraging news, obviously, across NATO that countries are going to meet the 2% pledge from the Wales conference. But how satisfied are you with the response so far in terms of strengthening defense, and what more do you think needs to be done?
Well, I'm very happy with countries, including Norway, over many years now, been strengthening defense budgets and also buying new equipment that, of course, as you know better than most, takes a long time to get it operational. From the time you decide to buy a new main battle tank or a new submarine or a new F-35, it takes some years until you have that capacity fully integrated into your armed forces. But the signals that are coming out of all European capitals right now, and the US and everywhere, I think, is that there is a need to enhance defense spending. And I don't think that people fully have realized what a landmark decision Germany made to get to 2%, to invest some 100 billion euros over the next years in defense. And of course, that has to do with history. I mean, Germany has for many years been saying that we're not entirely sure that Europe or the world is ready for a very big German army. And you could understand that from historical reasons. But I think the challenge that we all will be facing is twofold. One is that there will be a race for getting those capacities that we need. And that, again, has to do with supply chains. It has to do with, I would say, different ways of purchasing equipment. And it's going to be quite difficult for the suppliers to be able to answer up to all the demands and needs, because everything is happening at the same time. Everyone is wanting to invest right now very much. So I think we will have a situation where it can take some time until all the material and all the equipment will be ready to use in the respective countries. The second thing I think we have to be very, very mindful of is that we cannot apply yesterday's defense planning on today's and tomorrow's situations. So before we now enter into an enormous amount of spending on capacities that we are going to have in our respective armed forces for the next 30, 40, 50 years, we have to make sure that we ask all the right questions so that we just don't, because now everyone is spending so much money, so that we just don't pull out the drawer, take up everything from our wish list from 5 or 10 years back and say, now we have the money to actually buy this. That may not, or may be the right equipment or the right ideas for dealing with what we're seeing at the moment and is likely to see in the future. Just imagine, HR, and you know this well too, what technology has taken of enormous leaps over the past 5 years that we didn't even imagine 5 or 10 years back. And that has to be integrated in a way that makes our armed forces capable to deal with a set of challenges. And I think that this is going to be quite a difficult discussion in many countries, because we like to think that we just want to build on what we have, which in many cases can be absolutely right and correct. But in some cases, we have to kill our darlings and just find new ways of doing things because they work better for the situation that we are in right now. And I can repeat what I said at the beginning. We have to relate to the world as it is, not as we wish it was.
Right. And I think this breaking this pattern that we've been in for a long time of acquiring fewer and fewer, more exquisite, more expensive systems. I think what we're seeing in Ukraine is capacity. The size of the force matters a lot. And what's astonishing to me is how much ammunition is being fired there in Ukraine, which is, we talked about the deficiencies of Russian forces. It doesn't take a lot of skill to bombard residential areas and commit mass murder of civilians, which is what the Russians are doing now. But they've fired more artillery ammunition in the Russians have in Ukraine than the United States did across 20 years of war in Iraq and in Syria. So I think you're right, is that we have to think really about the broad range of challenges we're going to face and build in some new defense capabilities and keep some old ones around and combine them to be able to accomplish certain missions, like destroy Russia's fires complex, right, to protect civilian areas and protect our forces. Ine, you mentioned already the issue of energy security, and I think it's quite clear now that giving an authoritarian regime coercive power over your energy sector is a bad idea. And of course, I'm thinking of Germany and Nord Stream 2. And what do you see as trends in energy security associated with trying to also have an effort to reduce carbon emissions, but do so in a way that doesn't constrain growth and create economic difficulties? Norway is at the center of that debate and an innovator in that sector. What advice do you have for our listeners on how to improve energy security, and what's Norway's role in doing so?
Well, first and foremost, we've always been, and we will continue to be, a very reliable supplier of energy, and we do not politicize our contracts, for instance, and where we export to and what we do. And I think that's been extremely important from the get-go, that we have a different stance on this. I mean, when I was in Ukraine, as I told you, when I visited the contact line, there was a real, of course, discussion not only on Nord Stream 2, but it was a discussion that the Ukrainians even then felt very strongly, that Russia could kind of turn off the tap at any moment they desired. And the insecurity that gave to a whole population was, of course, enormous. They've learned to live with it in a way, because they tried to find other ways of circumventing that challenge. But it was very real, and it is very real. And you see now what Russia is doing. I think we can see more of that. And what we have been doing in the very short term is, of course, to produce at full capacity and then some, just to make sure that we can provide natural gas, that we also can provide petroleum when that is needed. And it definitely is right now. But at the same time, we have to make the shift. We have to make the green transition, because that's the only thing that's going to both give enough energy and enough environmentally sound energy over time, is to also make that transition. And to do both at the same time is a bit difficult when you have an energy crisis and you are also making a transition that was already well underway in many European countries. So my hope is that what we're seeing now is going to give that a little push, an acceleration. But we are going to need full capacity of also other energy sources at the moment. The challenge is that right now, everyone is looking to be more independent, of course, of Russian energy, very frankly speaking. And I have no problems with understanding that at all. The challenge, however, is that it's not easy to make that shift very quickly. And there are several reasons for that. One, of course, is that it is difficult to provide enough energy from other sources in the short term. The second point is that the long-term energy contracts have already been signed, and to divert that energy from countries who were supposed to receive it and to European countries in the short term is also very difficult.
Right.
The third point is that when you're looking into renewable energy like wind, like solar, it takes time to build. And of course, again, supply chain challenges comes into the mix here. So it takes longer than it could have done to actually build these capacities. And the irony, of course, is that the countries in Europe most reliant on Russian energy are also some of the countries who are less I would say, ready to receive other energy like LNG from the US, because there are no LNG terminals, or there are, but there are not too many terminals outside of Spain and Portugal, and no transmission capacity. So now Germany is building new terminals to receive LNG as one example. But these things are going to take time. So in the meantime, we will have to do as much as we can to keep energy supply stable and apolitical in a situation where everyone is looking for different solutions. And I think it's a very good thing that we all get less reliant on Russian energy. But we have to realize that it is going to take some time.
And, isn't this a lesson that's relevant to China as well? Because so many supply chains have become really vulnerable to disruption in China, with single points of failure there, or over-reliance on really critical components for the energy transition, like rare earths and batteries and magnets and you name it. So I know you mentioned how NATO now is focused more on the threat from China, especially after Putin and Xi Jinping expressed their enduring love for each other, or at least no limits to their friendship just prior to the reinvasion of Ukraine in February. What is your perspective on the threat from China, the economic threat, as we see Lithuania, for example, come under coercive pressure from China? And how is Norway responding? And what do you think needs to be done more broadly across European nations and in North America and our developed free market economies?
Well, I think first and foremost, just a comment to your enduring friendship point on Putin and Xi. Well, I think it's fair to say that the strategic partnership between the two countries is a strong one. But I think that China also is wary about what is happening to Russia, because they do not necessarily have an interest in a weak Russia, because Russia is taking care of, in a way, the Chinese interests in our part of the world, and they can focus on the South China Sea, for instance. So this is really, I would say, a relationship that rests on a lot of different, I would say, points, and of course, one of them being that Russia is more dependent on China than China is on Russia, and I think that's quite obvious. And what holds up part of the Chinese model is also that they have access to Western markets to sell their goods. And if they, for instance, are hit by sanctions, they could suffer a real blow into their ability to secure, for instance, economic growth. So this is a very, I would say, a very interesting and a very kind of delicate balance here. And I think you're absolutely right that the interest in NATO now for looking into China is much greater. And I've said repeatedly also in Norway that the fact that NATO is now discussing China does not mean that it is a military answer to the question China. But unless NATO takes into account how our security surroundings are changing, we are not doing our job. So when we are looking into China, we are looking into the world's second biggest economy. We're looking into the world's biggest, at least in numbers, navy. And we have to take into account what it means that these changes have taken place. And again, that doesn't mean that one looks as China as a military threat to Europe or to NATO, but we have to look at what our surroundings are like. And this is a part of that analysis that I think is absolutely good and vital that NATO has been doing. And I've seen over the course of the past years also the quite unanimous approach by NATO countries to this assessment and to the analysis. But I also think it's important to put China and Russia in different baskets, so to say, because they represent something different when it comes to strategic challenge and threat to NATO countries. And I think that's really important to do. So I think that when it comes to being dependent on China and the value chains, I think we've seen both during the pandemic and also now that the dependence in general is too big. At the same time, I think everyone needs to see a functioning world economy. You and I are both warm defenders of free trade. But of course, we have to take into account security concerns. Otherwise, we wouldn't take our job seriously, and we wouldn't be good advocates for our national interests in this. So, and that is extremely important. And that is also why I think there has been a very interesting debate in most European countries, both in the EU as an organization, but also in individual European countries and in the countries that are not members of the EU, but still are very closely linked to the EU economically, on how to deal with these challenges, how to deal with a dependency that can make us vulnerable in a situation of crisis. Should we make sure that more production takes place in Europe? Should we find alternatives elsewhere? And that doesn't mean that you're shutting out trading with China, for instance, but you have to be aware of the dependencies and the possible vulnerabilities it creates for you. And I think it's been very interesting to see also how this has played out in the China-US context, where in the beginning, there were many people who looked at the strategic, I would say, competition or the big power rivalry between US and China as something that had to do only with trade and tariffs. But that's just a small part of it. This is a deep strategic competition, and it has to do with a lot more. It has to do with values, it has to do with trade, it has to do with security. And I think you have to understand kind of the whole spectrum of this to really understand what the challenges may be, and also how we are going to deal with an increasing interdependency and also potential vulnerability, especially when it comes to the security arena that we all have to deal with. We cannot shy away from those discussions, even though we may choose different solutions from time to time.
I'm so glad you raised the values point, because of course every Chinese company has to act as an arm of the Chinese Communist Party. And I was really encouraged by the German government's decision recently to no longer underwrite Volkswagen's manufacturing in a province where genocide is happening in Xinjiang. So I think it's going to become tougher and tougher for, I think, Norwegian companies, American companies, any Western companies to do business in China without compromising their values. And I think that's a big aspect, I think, of minimizing risk in economic relations and financial relations with China. You know, I've got two last fun questions for you, because we've covered so much and it's been a real tour de force. But you're one of the very few people that I'm aware of, who's been both Minister of Defense and Minister of Foreign Affairs. I mean, George Marshall comes to mind, for me here in the United States. And you've always struck me as someone who is very sensitive to the need to integrate what we're doing diplomatically with our military capabilities, what we're doing militarily. Could you just talk a little bit about the experience of being both Foreign Minister and Minister of Defense, and what our viewers and those who are interested in public policy and in strategy should learn from your experience?
Well, I would say first and foremost, it's really been a privilege to hold both positions, and to be able to do this for 8 years it doesn't seem like a long time, but when you're a minister, 8 years is quite some time, and you really need a vacation when you go off government after 8 years. But it's really been a privilege. But it's also been at a time where we have seen so many changes completely in our defense sector, in our diplomatic sector. The world has changed so dramatically that it's really been also a 24/7 job, I would say. And I would say that I when I came into the foreign ministry, I was very happy that I had 4 years as a defense minister before that. When I became a defense minister, I was very happy that I had 4 years as chairman of the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee in Parliament before that, because it gives you a bit of perspective. And back in 2009, when I started as chair of the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee, we were in the first year of a joint committee. We had one defense committee and one foreign affairs committee before that. And I was one of those advocating a joint committee because, in my opinion, it's impossible to see the two aspects separated from each other, especially in our world. And I think it's really been a strength that we have a joint committee in Parliament. And I think it was good to have those 4 years of defense minister before becoming Minister of Foreign Affairs. And I've always said, and I strongly believe in this, that what has always given Norway our space for maneuver in foreign policy is our ability to join and to be part of alliances. And I would say the most important part of this, in my opinion, is, of course, NATO, when you look at security policy. The fact that other countries are willing to risk their own soldiers' health and, in extremis, their life to support and to defend others is, in my opinion, the clearest example of being an ally you can possibly find. And without allies, big countries and small countries would face a very, very different reality. And it's the alliances that keeps us together. And the alliances that we are working with, like NATO, is both a military but also a political alliance. And unless we look at the political side of this, our alliances will be weaker. As one example, I mean, we are, as a military alliance, not stronger than our political cohesion. You know well, too, that unless we agree on the threat perception, the analysis, and also, in the most extreme cases, the willingness to invoke Article 5, we can have all the military strength we want, but we are not stronger militarily than our political cohesion. And that is why I think we need to invest equally in both. And again, that is why I think having had both perspectives offers something that is good and valuable when you're working with these issues in a world that has been turned upside down several times over the past 10 years.
Absolutely. War is indeed a contest of wills. And I often quote Secretary George Shultz, just passed away here relatively recently at the age of 100 at the Hoover Institution. And he said that negotiation is a euphemism for capitulation unless the shadow of power is cast across the bargaining table. And I think it's just a great way to explain the need to integrate what you're doing militarily to what you're trying to achieve politically. The last question has to do with jumping out of airplanes. I mean, is it true that you jump out of airplanes to relax?
Well, when you ask pilots in the Air Force, they have a tendency to say that we just do not understand the point of jumping out of a plane that works. And I can see that and I can understand that. But I really find a lot of joy in jumping out of planes. Having said that, I'm having, of course, a parachute. I'm not just jumping off, but it's really something that I really enjoy doing. I haven't been doing it so much lately, but I've had the privilege of several jumps, and it's really been very fun, very fascinating. And you've done it also, haven't you? Several times.
I think I have a record, and my record is the biggest gap in between jumps. So I jumped in Airborne Ranger School in 85. I jumped again as commander of Fort Benning, Georgia in 2014 after my 10-minute refresher class.
Oh. Okay, well, but you know the feeling of that complete kind of the jumping off or just leaning
well, you
out
go
of
from a
the
noisy environment to just complete silence and drifting.
Exactly. It's just so fascinating that it's really, when you just jump out or lean out, it's a lot of noise, it's a lot of speed, it's a lot of everything, and the chute goes up and everything is just completely quiet. And I mean, the free fall is amazing. The quiet is amazing. And for me, that has really been a treasure to experience.
Just make sure good people are packing your chute. That's the most important thing.
Yes, definitely.
What a pleasure it's been to talk with you. I'd like to just give you an opportunity to say anything you'd like to in conclusion to our listeners and our viewers. Anything you'd like to add for our international audience?
Well, I think that has to be a point or two on Russia, because in addition to what we talked about, I think it is extremely important that the world does not shy away from the aggression and the threat that Russia is posing to its neighboring countries. And Russia doesn't seem to have any interest in finding a political solution after the invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February. But it has to be a political solution at some point. But Ukraine has to be in the driver's seat as to what that kind of solution is going to look like. But I think it's important also to look at the history here and to see that this renewed attack on Ukraine didn't come out of the blue. It followed a very clear path where I think that also the West or like-minded countries' lack of firm responses has allowed or made it possible for Russia to go further steps. And my experience in both foreign and defense policy is that when you are dealing with Russia, you have to make sure that you set very clear boundaries for what kind of issues or behavior you accept, because if you do not push back, it is seen as an acceptance of a position, which it is not. And I mean, we have experienced a good neighborship with Russia. We have never been at war with Russia, but we have also seen a change in the internal situation in Russia that has spilled over on foreign policy very clearly. The clamping down on civil society, the complete disregard of basic human rights, and also the fact that it is impossible nowadays to be an opposition in Russia. And what he has done, what Putin has done and the regime has done to everyone that tries to oppose or position themselves with a different opinion has been devastating to see. And of course, that spills over in the possibilities we've seen also over the past years to cooperate on areas where we have joint interests. I mean, we have a long history of cooperation with Russia, either on fisheries management, people-to-people contact, nuclear security and safety, environmental issues. But of course, the space for this has been shrinking gradually and quite rapidly, I would say, over the past years. And that is due to Russian behavior. We have always had to deal with Russia with firmness and predictability. That's part of our neighborly relations. But now the scope for any kind of political cooperation is gone. And I said back in 2014 that our relationship with Russia was changed forever. And there were a lot of people who criticized that at that time. But I think it was right to say it then. I think it is correct now. And of course, right now, it is Russia who holds the key to how Western countries is going to deal with the country in the future. But to see the scope for the kind of cooperation that Western countries have had with Russia for many, many years is very, very difficult right now.
Minister Søreide, on behalf of the Hoover Institution, thank you for your leadership and your example. Thank you for helping us learn more about battlegrounds that are important to building a better future, a future of peace and prosperity for generations to come. What a pleasure it's been to be with you again.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And I really hope that even though you had to get up early, you are going to survive the day. It's been a pleasure.
It was totally worth it. Totally worth it to be with you. Thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure to be with you.
Battlegrounds is a production of the Hoover Institution, where we advance ideas that define a free society. For more information about our work, to hear more of our podcasts, or view our video content, please visit hoover.org.